We have a very sophisticated audience online, and these are people, as I said, that are joining us from the region. They are, whether they are joining us from our US embassies out there, or whether the Arab embassies or the various departments of state and energy and commerce, we have a whole array of folks. But even more notably, we've got companies, the private sector, individuals that literally have billions of dollars of investments, of assets out there, and this is that time when they are risk assessing. They want a perspective. They need to plan, and I really can't think of a more prestigious panel in the sense that can give us real insights as to this administration, the Biden administration, because all, our panel are career diplomats, and of course they served under the Obama and Biden administrations in the region in which we're discussing. So I know that they're going to give us a very interesting perspective. So let me give you a little snapshot of who they are. I could take the whole hour on each of them, but we are going to start with Ambassador Susan Ziadeh. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula Affairs from 2014 to 2016. Prior to that, she served as the U.S. Ambassador to the state of Qatar. She was served as the NEA Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. She served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, was the official spokesperson at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Bahrain. She's had overseas postings in Kuwait, Oman, Jerusalem, acting Deputy Director of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. So she's going to give us a really the big picture assessment. Of course, then we'll hand it over to Ambassador Barbara Leaf, who was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Affairs from 2013 to 2014. And then she served as the U.S. Ambassador to the UAE, one of our most important bilateral relationships between the U.S. and the Middle East. She was there from 2014 to 2018. She also served as the as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq. She directed the U.S. Provincial Reconstruction Team in Basra, Iraq, and she served as the department's first director of the Office of Iranian Affairs, and served in posts in Cairo and Tunis and Jerusalem as well. And we also have on our panel Ambassador Deborah Jones. She served in the state of Libya from 2013 to 2015, the post-Gaddafi era. And then before that, she was the U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait from 2008 and 2011. She also was the principal officer at the U.S. Consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. And like all the other ambassadors, had responsibilities throughout the region with many notable posts. So I think we're gonna between the three of them, we're gonna hope to cover a good part of the region, and we also hope that we're gonna address so many of the questions that were submitted. So what I would like to start with is Ambassador Ziadeh, and what I want to ask her is if she could kind of frame the situation for us now, give us a perspective of where we are and where we might be heading as we transition from President Trump to a President-elect Biden. Susan, I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Ida, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be on the same panel with my colleagues, Ambassador Barbara Leaf and Ambassador Deborah Jones. I'd like to take a look at the overall posture towards the region and what we might anticipate Middle East policy to be under a Biden administration, at least with response to the Gulf. First of all, I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration right off the bat will be more concerned directly with repairing transatlantic relationships, NATO relationships, some of those relationships with longstanding allies that have been frayed. But This is not to say that our relations with countries in the Middle East will not continue. Of course, our relations with Gulf countries will continue. This is not a disengagement, because for us, our interests are always to promote stability and regional security, to defeat terrorism, and we always seek to encourage regional cooperation, and in particular with our forces in the region, in the case of, for example, naval cooperation to prevent piracy and promote a safe maritime environment. Where I think things will be different is that the relationships with GCC countries in general will not be as transactional under a Biden administration as they have been under the current Trump administration. I think there is great concern in the region about great power competition and a rising China. Mark Milley, the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recently talked about his focus on Russia and China and his concern with how that will have an impact on the U.S. going forward. But this does not mean that at least I don't believe it means that there will be a complete pivot to Asia and leaving the Middle East in the dust, so to speak. I think that our posture will continue to be there. And if you look at the number of military that we have in the whole area of responsibility, from Egypt all the way to Afghanistan, we're at about 35,000 servicemen and women in the region from all the different branches of the military. I think we will look to the GCC for more participation in regional security responsibilities, burden sharing in the broadest sense. And in this case, I don't mean just financially, but where they will have the GCC countries military deployed, taking on responsibilities. We already see this with the UAE and how they have worked with us, for example, with their special forces in Afghanistan. With regards to the GCC navies, they are already part of our combined forces, maritime forces out of NAVCENT in Bahrain, and they all patrol the waters along with our navies. So these multilateral efforts will continue, and I think this is important to note that this was how the Biden administration, I believe, will look at things going forward. I think there are several points for the Biden administration that they'll be looking at in the region. Certainly Iran and the potential for reopening talks on the nuclear file with Iran. I know my colleague, Ambassador Leaf, will address this issue, but I think this does harken back to the issue of the transatlantic relationships and the need to shore up alliances with the P5+1, particularly the 3 European members who were important members of those negotiations. So let's turn to Saudi Arabia now. This is the country you asked me to focus on. And what are our issues with Saudi Arabia going forward? The first one, and I'm just going to mention it briefly, not because it's not important, but because it hasn't been one that the current administration is focused on. And we will have yet to see how the incoming administration will look at that. And that's the issue of human rights, governance, political participation, all the values that we as Americans espouse, and American concerns for these issues in Saudi Arabia going forward. They have been raised by the Congress during the past 4 years. Certain congressional delegations have gone out there. They've looked at these issues, particularly with regards to things like the women activists who've been locked up for several years now. Issues of even American citizens and their ability to have freedom of expression in the region. There's a whole host of issues on the human rights file that I believe this incoming administration will address. But let's focus on the other two, which have been very much in plain view in terms of relations with Saudi Arabia. And the first one is the war in Yemen. for our listeners and viewers, they all know that this presumed short-term Saudi intervention in March of 2015 was at the request of the legitimate government of Yemen. It was in support of the Hadi government, and it also was in response to rockets that were being fired from northern Yemen into Saudi Arabia. This is a breach of international law, creating casualties along the border. This has been going on now for 4 years with no resolution in sight. There have been thoughts about discussions and what might be possible in terms of negotiations. But even if the Saudis halt their intervention at this stage, there's still the issue of the internal Yemeni civil war and how to convince the Houthis to come to the negotiating table and negotiate in earnest. The role of the Houthis who have taken over good parts of Yemen from 2014, their role and their role as political actors are included in the GCC initiative and the national dialogue outcomes. And these documents predate their takeover of Sana'a in September of 2014. So they understand that they have a place at the table. But how this will all unfold is yet to be seen as negotiations go forward under UN auspices. Now, recent discussions in Washington under the Trump administration about designating the Houthis as foreign terrorist organization, which would certainly undermine the UN envoy Martin Griffiths' efforts to bring about a negotiated settlement. And second, if indeed they were designated a terrorist organization, this would in essence block NGOs from distributing badly needed humanitarian assistance to a huge part of the Yemeni civilian population. So if we look at the issues of the administration, they will certainly be reassessing U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia in the context of the war, whether it's munitions, logistical support, intelligence sharing. And Tony Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State, has said that we will be undertaking a strategic review of the bilateral relationship. The last issue I want to talk about briefly is the Gulf Rift, and we can come back to this in the Q&A. But basically, we have the upcoming meeting of the GCC January 5th in Riyadh. And we know that there have been a movement by Secretary Pompeo and Jared Kushner to try and come up with some kind of halt to this rift and maybe looking for a way to shore up a bit of that wall of GCC opposition to Iran. And in this case, the Saudis also are of somewhat a like mind, maybe seeking to bring down the temperature a bit. So we will see what will happen at this meeting. But for now, the things that seem to be on the table for discussion is the reopening of Saudi airspace to Qatar Airways, which would in essence deny the Iranians an estimated 100 million in fees, which is part of the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And we can continue with more discussion of this in the Q&A. Thank you.